So welcome everyone to our first inaugural discussion forum, which is on Art View Now, which is about the ideas of artists who are contemporaries who have introduced innovative and exciting things in our state of South Carolina and beyond. And of course, our inaugural guest is Dr. Leo Franklin Twiggs, who is crucial as being our very first guest on this discussion program because the whole idea of the discussion is to talk about the contributions of various artists to not only the culture of South Carolina, but even areas beyond. And literally, this is being brought and sponsored through the IP Stanback Museum, which is essentially the house that Dr. Twiggs built. So with that being said, we're going to continue, and our discussion will center on the idea of politics and perception. So the perception, politics, identity, and heritage, because these are the themes that are featured in Dr. Twiggs' works. As I was saying before, Dr. Twiggs literally created, the museum was built around him and around the concepts that he promulgated. And this occurred some 40 years ago. So this is the 40th anniversary of the existence of the IP Stanback Museum. So this is the house that Dr. Twiggs built. So Dr. Leo Twiggs, welcome to your own house.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks for inviting me.
And here we see the museum and planetarium. And the planetarium is a very distinctive building on campus because it is a large round brick structure. Some 40 years ago, Dr. M. Maceo Nance actually hired you before that to start the art program at South Carolina State University. And he came up with the idea of establishing a planetarium. And he came up with the idea of establishing a museum. And the planetarium is actually the brainchild of Dr. Clemmy Weber. Could you talk just a little bit about this whole concept of creating a museum and planetarium on the campus?
Maceo Nance, who was president at the time, was somebody who was new to the scene in terms of college administrations. He had succeeded Benner C. Turner, who left under controversy. We were in the 60s now, and there were people marching in the streets. And he became president of the university, and I was there because I came in 64. And I think it was like a storm coming together, because I had ideas about what I wanted to do in an art program. And I think when I got there and I started doing some things, I started experimenting with batik and getting some coverage. And I think he felt that I was bringing some notoriety to the university. And so he just kind of really supported me. What I did first, before the gallery, the forerunner of that was a gallery in the basement of the library called the Whitaker Gallery. I made a handsome brochure, sent it around to my friends across the country, and we ended up going down there, and the president went down there as well. And I think it got to him because he's a fellow who wanted to always go first class. And so one day he said, we're going to build a museum where students can meditate. Well, I didn't think much of it then. I've learned since that was an outstanding way to go. But we were trying to build a state museum at the time. So I was on that board of the state museum, and we couldn't get any money. But Dr. Nance knew some people around. In fact, we got $50,000 from the Close Foundation, Springs Mills, and he got $100,000 from the Cresty Foundation. And he got some money from Senator Gressett, who Black people were beginning to vote then. And Dr. Nance reminded him of that. And he pushed that museum because he was a very powerful figure in the legislature. And he pushed the museum through, and the museum came in at $1.25 million. Oh. And it was a structure that was very different and very unique in the state. It was that Dr. Nance had this idea that we had too many, what he called file draw buildings on the campus. He wanted our architecture and the campus to look differently. If you notice the library, which won an award, is very different from the other structures around it. It was one of those things that Dr. Nance was pushing for. And so when he decided to do a museum and he brought it up and had the money for it, we had a meeting, and in that meeting, he told a group of senior faculty members and deans that he was going to build a museum. And one of the faculty members said, "That's great, Mr. President, we'll get a committee." And he said, "We don't need a committee, let him do it." And I'll never forget that. He pointed to me and said, "Let him do it." He said, "This is not an academic building, this is an art museum, let him do it." And of
Well,
course, I was a junior faculty member. And so,
but
but
he
I
had an
had
excellent idea. The reason I'm saying he had an excellent idea is this is an image of the galleries. And so this was a very innovative space when you took charge of this project, because you used these modular units so that you could reconfigure the gallery space. So he had this insight to, because at that point you were the young man on campus, you said you were a
yeah.
junior faculty member. So he had this insight to let you move forward. And what's interesting to me is that you're showing the political aspect of the establishment of this art facility on our campus, because you talked about how he negotiated with Gresset, who was in the state legislature, how he found additional funds. So as a leader, as a president, he was out front making sure you had those assets.
Yeah, that's true. I think that without him, it wouldn't have happened. And I think his interest in art also helped me with my career at the university.
Well, this is one of the exhibitions, or one of the collections that you brought to the university, an extraordinary collection from the exhibition that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1969 called Harlem on My Mind. Would you talk just a little bit about acquiring the Seminole Collection? Because this is a direct link between our university and the Schaumburg Institute of the New York Public Library System.
Well, I didn't know that that was even available. I went to New Haven, Connecticut, met some folks from Yale University, and one of the fellows told me that collection was stored in a warehouse down on 42nd Street in the New York Public Library, and that they might be interested in giving it to a university or to an institution. So I called them immediately, and they said, after about a couple of weeks of deliberation, they said, "You can come and get it." And it took me a long time to get it, because there were people about how would we get it here. We tried to call alumni in New York, couldn't get it. So we just decided to rent a U-Haul, and Dr. Don Walters drove that U-Haul to New York, and we got there just in time, because the San Francisco Museum had already made plans to come and get it if we didn't get it, because we had a time finding the money to get it. But he brought it down, almost ran off a ramp and turned a small truck over because it was so loaded. But when it got here and we started unloading it, that's when we realized what a treasure we had.
Well, I have to point out that Dr. Don Walter is currently the professor of physics on the campus. So this is already a collaboration between the sciences and the arts, which is the foundational idea of the museum and planetarium that was established under your leadership. So I'm going to go on and look a little bit at the collections and other collections that were a part of what you brought. Now, this is from the McDonald Collection, which is one of several collections of African artifacts as well as African American art. And you were the primary mover in terms of the determining what that collection would hold. And it has been augmented by a later additions from, well, I've helped somewhat myself with the Armand Collection. Of course, Ellen Zischultz became a director later on. But the largest portion of that collection, I think, is work that's derived from your leadership. So would you talk a little bit about the McDonalds and Nancy and Roderick McDonald, who gave that first major gift?
Well, if you notice, we just got the photographs, with giant photographs, Van der Zee, a lot of historic photographs in that collection. And from the outset, Dr. Nance said that we want this museum to be a museum of African and African American art, because no museum in the state at the time collected and preserved and promoted African art. And we have a large Black population here. And so he thought the museum was an asset to that. And so we had the photographic collection, and then the McDonald's came along. Mr. McDonald had been with the USDA, Department of Agriculture, and he was retiring, and he lived in Africa for a very long time. He and his wife had this great collection, and he brought it and offered it to us after he looked at our facility, and that's how we acquired that collection.
Well, I wanted to say too that what's so interesting is that this particular mask I'm showing is from the Sande Society of the Mende people, and the Mende is a very important ethnic group. If you think about the Gullah Geechee culture, those baskets that everyone is so aware of in Charleston and Mount Pleasant and the Barrier Islands from North Carolina all the way down to Georgia, the coil technique for that basket weaving derives primarily from the Mende people, and this is a Mende mask for a woman's society. And the spirit that's represented here is the Bundu spirit. So when you collected these objects, you actually were collecting things from the ethnic background of the people, of the gene pool of the peoples who had formerly been enslaved in South Carolina. So it's amazing that you would have this at an HBCU.
Well, it's one of the things that you have to, a museum can't be everything to everybody. So you have to limit your collection within the scope of the mission of the museum.
So as you were collecting things, like you said, the Harlem on My Mind collection had works by Van der Zee, by Lloyd Yearwood, by a number of noted African-American photographers. But that exhibition was controversial because they excluded the Black fine arts. They excluded Romar Bearden and Jacob Lawrence and others who were working in the fine arts. So by having this museum, you were creating this opportunity for students and for interns. And this is just some students standing in the collection of works that when you were there, we collected images from Cecil Williams, who is, of course, a South Carolina treasure. And we gave Cecil Williams his very first exhibition, as I recall.
Yeah.
And here's Cornelius Blanding and Zaire McPherson. And young Zaire McPherson in this image just graduated from Duke University with the MFA. So this is part of your legacy as well.
Yeah, Frank, what's important to me is that the museum was a teaching space. It was not just a space where students would come in and look at art. That's why when the museum created and the interior design was created, we did a model of those modular units so that students could lay out the museum and come in and study how to create exhibits and how to create spaces and how to write about images and how to do critical essays about things in the museum so we could develop brochures. I mean, it's gratifying to me that we have somebody who came through the museum and ended up going on to get a degree in museum work. It's just gratifying. Our first, that's the second thing, Lisa Ray, when she came through university, went on to become the first curator at the Columbia Museum, first
Right.
African-American curator. But she came through the Stanback Museum because I hired her there.
I remember meeting Lisa. I think she eventually moved back to Virginia from South Carolina. But you also, when you got to South Carolina State, they did not have their own university logo. And you told me the story of creating this logo, which is so poignantly connected to the history of South Carolina. Did you want to tell us anything about the original logo you created for the official logo of South Carolina State? It was then South Carolina State College. Here it's shown updated when they became a university, I think under Dr. Barbara Hatton in what, 1993, 92?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
this is the official seal of the university. And again, this is Dr. Nance moving away from the 70s into moving away from the 60s into another era. And at the time when he became president, the official seal of South Carolina State University was the logo of the state of South Carolina.
mhm.
And all the trepidations that came about with students being killed by the patrol and all of that. And so what he wanted to do was get a logo that was distinctly South Carolina State. So Dr. Barbara Williams Jenkins did the research, and I designed the logo. And if you notice, it has the names in it and an example of Morrill Hall, which is one of the first buildings on the campus.
So in the logo, you have this oval that has the image of Morrill Hall, which was built by the students and is named for Justin Morrill, who was the congressman who established the land grant acts for the establishment of the land grant institutions in I think it was 1862, and then the 1890 institutions were primarily for the African, the schools that were organized for freed African, formerly enslaved Africans. And then you have the motto, Scientia Officium Honors, which is knowledge, duty, and honor, as the motto of the school. And I thought that was just so poignant and again, beautifully organized.
One of the things too with that logo, they will notice that it's oval instead of circular. We wanted to get as far away from that state logo as we could. And so I decided to design an oval logo rather than the traditional circular logo.
Now, the other thing you had an extraordinary hand in is supporting the design by Harvey Gantt of the Fine Arts Building, which the museum is in its 40th year. The Fine Arts Building, this is the 21st year of the opening and dedication of the Fine Arts Building. And would you talk a little bit about making sure that Harvey Gantt was also involved as one of the people who designed this structure, which really will merit being an historic structure within a few years because of who Harvey Gantt is and what he contributed to the history of our state?
I've always wanted to have a structure on campus designed by Harvey Gantt. Harvey Gantt, as you know, integrated Clemson University. And he was an architect that many of our African-American institutions tried to get to do a building. He has a chapel on the campus of Morris College and several buildings around. But our state was very close to getting people from outside. It was just that we had an old boy system that just locked people out. And when Dr. Smith became president, he had been to A&T. He knew about Harvey Gantt because he was also mayor of Charlotte. And he said, we're going to get this building designed by Harvey. I knew Harvey. We got together, and Dr. Smith had a time. It wasn't easy, but he made sure that Harvey was the person. And I sat with Harvey many, many days. What happened is Dr. Evans, the late Dr. Evans, who was the chair of the music department, the two of us would sit down with Harvey and design the building. He would design his part, I would design my part. And one of the things in the design, I knew we wanted to get accredited by the arts organization. And so I designed the building with all of the requirements that they would have. The other thing I said to Harvey more than anything else, and I said it to Lucas and Stubbs, who designed the museum, is that when you come on campus, I don't want people to say, where's the art building or where's the museum? I want them to look at the building and say, this must be the place.
And it's a beautiful building. And you're absolutely right. When the university was able to have the programs, the art programs that you initiated, accredited by NASAD, the National Association of Schools of Art and Design, one of the great assets is this building, where you have spaces for exhibitions, you have spaces for performances, you have spaces for both arts, studio activities, and you have the small gallery that's there for student exhibitions, and the lobby that we're seeing here, and the amphitheater outside. So it's so important to have someone who understands how a building must function as an art, as a creative center, to be heavily involved in its organization and design. So this is the lobby of the Fine Arts facility. And so would you talk a little bit about why did young Leo Franklin Twiggs become interested in art and art education? So you're about how old in this image? This is one of your messages from home.
About 6 years old, I suspect. My mom said that I wasn't making good grades, so they were gonna, if I made good grades, she would buy me a suit. I think that's that suit she promised me.
It's a very nice suit. But what was it? Because see, you've been, not only are you a fine artist, but you're also an arts administrator, and you've served on so many boards all across the state. You've won so many awards. You have the Elizabeth O'Neill Verner Award twice, a special award, recognition for lifetime achievement, as well as being one of the first artists to win the award. You have the Order of the Palmetto. You had the special award from the Gibbs Museum down in Charleston. Was the 1848 award? Is that what it was called?
1858.
1858 award.
1858 Society Award.
Right.
It's for contemporary Southern art, which I thought was interesting, an interesting title.
Well, we're probably going to see why you received that award for contemporary Southern art because of some of the work that you did. And this is one of your early commemoration series. I think this is probably from about 1970.
Yeah, 1970, I came to South Carolina State in 1964. Mm-hmm. And I started just experimenting with the Confederate flag because I went to the University of Georgia, and on my way there, you'd pass through southern towns like Washington, Georgia. And on a Confederate Memorial Day, they'd have so many flags flying up there. I looked in my rearview mirror and expect to see a regiment coming up behind me. And it was very interesting how the Confederate flag lived as if the war was still going on, and it wasn't, as Margaret Mitchell wrote, gone with the wind. And so their fascination with this revival of the Confederacy was something that prompted me to do this series called Commemoration. Those are old flags, and I wanted to show them as deteriorated objects that people are holding on to, as if I started by saying, what would happen if you go into an attic and pick up a Confederate flag that was almost 100 years old? What would it be like? Would it crumble in your hands? And so I just thought about that when I was creating this object.
And what made you decide to begin to use this unusual method of batik? Because that is not a conventional approach to how works of art generally look. Now, this is a photograph by Cecil Williams of Ku Klux Klan rally in Orangeburg, which shows one of the reasons people in South Carolina were so dedicated to this particular flag is because William Porcher Miles, who was later became a mayor of Charleston, designed this naval battle jack for the Confederacy that was used in the Virginia regiments, but it became this kind of emblem of Southern heritage, but it also was used by the Ku Klux Klan, and we'll see later it was used by someone like Dylan Roof. So when you were creating your works, what was inspiring you to use batik?
Well, batik is a method of decorating fabric. And while I was at Art Institute of Chicago in 1961, it was just something that I was introduced to as a craft. This woman also wore these scarves, and I loved the color quality of it. And I just said, what if I tried to paint with it? And so it took 5, 6, 7 years to really perfect the idea, because it's dye, and dye runs all over the place. Batik has this unique quality of crackles and all of that created by crushing the wax in your hands and dipping it in a dye solution to create these intricate cracks. And my aim was to control the cracks, control the viscosity of the dyes so that they work as plastic elements in a composition. It still surprises me that I will do workshops for people and they'd look at it and say, I want to do some of that. And then you come back later and say, oh, it's too long. It's too much time consuming. And it is very time consuming and very unforgiving, because once you dip something in dye, if the colors don't come out right, you have to end up throwing it away. I threw away a lot of stuff in my early days. People ask me, where did you throw it? But I don't. It's just experimenting. And another thing that I should say about Dr. Nance, when I started experimenting with batik, I had to cordon off a part of the back of my classroom, because I do it at night and I'd have a string over it. So I taught the students in the front of the classroom, and I experimented at the back of the classroom. And then he found a place for me to work. And to have administrators say, here, this is a room you can work in, is something that was very unusual for his time.
Well, I'm showing right now on the screen an early painting. This is an oil on canvas painting. and you received the award as an innovative contemporary Southern artist. And I wanted to show this because this is one of your still life pictures of a watermelon, and the watermelon has such an interesting history in, I guess, African American life in terms of the stereotype, because it is an African fruit. And in some ways, the watermelon may have been a kind of life-saving fruit, because it would have been used on slave ships because of the nutritional value it had and because of how long it could be stored. But this is a Thomas Hovenden image of a young man with a watermelon, of course, Winslow Homer. So when you picked up this theme, this was a very typically Southern image, but you don't, it's not in the stereotypical context that you often would see the watermelon. And so often your work does that. It creates some kind of an innovation on a standard theme of the South. Now, was this done when you were at the Art Institute, this image?
Now, I had come from there. In fact, that was done later on. Before that was probably one of the last pieces I did before I started experimenting with batik. And for me, I'm all about composition, because I think the way you put something in a work also emphasizes meanings of the work. And if you notice that I use a unique kind of perspective that I find works for me. I put what is important maybe larger than it ought to be, because I want to show with that knife in the watermelon a kind of piercing of the old stereotypes. And that's what the ideas I had in mind when I was doing it.
So you're cutting away that old stereotype. The other thing is that this tilting up of the table is a very classic, it reminds me of the Paul Cézanne. So as an artist, you're also functioning as an intellectual, as someone who's very aware of art history. And I find that fascinating also to look at in your work, because the works are a kind of demonstration of these various nuanced areas of knowledge that are part of what you're communicating to your spectators, to your viewers.
It comes from years and years of teaching art, of talking to students, looking at art, teaching about what other artists have done and how they've created their works.
So here you're an abstractionist, and this is a very, very powerful abstract work. Red Thing. Who was it that influenced you to experiment with abstraction?
Hale Woodruff. I had this is one of the first abstracts paintings that I completed when I was at NYU. I went to NYU very fresh out of that traditional mold that you saw in watermelons, and I had not started with batiks yet. But when I went there, everybody was slushing paint around, because this was the middle of the abstract expressionist period. And for a moment there, I was really lost. And then I became friends with Professor Woodruff. He kind of took me under his wings. And I think what I remember more than anything about him is that time when he came in and asked all of us the first day of class to just do something. And here I am at big New York University, slushing things around the paper. And afterward, he came up to me and said, "Twigs, I like your work. Where are you from?" And I told him, he says, "You one of Arthur Rose's boys." I said, "Yeah," because he knew Arthur Rose. Arthur Rose had been there earlier. But it was the first time that an artist of Hale Woodruff's character and fame mentioned my work, and mentioned it in an artistic way by saying, "I like your work," because he saw something in it. And it was kind of unconscious there. I just did something because he asked us to take some charcoal and to do something. And it was elated. I was elated about his comments.
Well, let me just point out too, because our students may not be familiar, as familiar as they ought to be, with who Hale Woodruff is and with who Arthur Rose is, even although Arthur Rose is local to Orangeburg. Arthur Rose had a national presence because he helped start the National Conference of Artists. I think you went to that very first organizational conference.
Yes.
Which is a national organization of African American artists. But Hale Woodruff was an artist who was a part of the Harlem Renaissance. And he at first, I think, taught down at Atlanta University, and then he ended up at New York University, a mainstream institution. And he was getting big shows in major museums, the Whitney Museum of American Art and also I think it was being collected by the Museum of Modern Art. And it's interesting that Hale Woodruff is one of the artists who has a discussion in the bulletin from the Metropolitan Museum of Art when they had the symposium led by Romar Bearden for that response to the Harlem on My Mind exhibition. So Hale Woodruff was very, very much a big deal. And for him to praise your work as such a young artist, that was extraordinary.
Yeah, I felt that myself.
So after this experiment with the red thing, and in fact, here's, I think, a work by Hale Woodruff. Now, Hale Woodruff had actually started out as a muralist with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, in the 1930s. And then he changed from his figurative style to this more abstract style. So it's interesting to see how he influenced you. But then this is a work that you did in your new batik style. This is Nightbird, and you told this story about being a young boy looking out the window, and you have these interesting shadowy figures in the background. Could you talk a little bit about this piece because it has some autobiographical elements?
Well, where we live, I had 5 brothers and a sister. And when you have 5 brothers and a sister and you're in a relatively small house, you got some folks living together closely. And so my brothers and sisters, my sister had a room by herself, which she stayed with in the room with my mom because my father died when I was 15. And so we all lived in this house. But late at night, all my brothers would be sleeping and I would be in the bed and looking up, and there was a window much like that outside. And I remember seeing this bird, this black bird flying around, and I'd say to myself, I wonder how this bird sees the world below. Is he flying over the house? What does this bird look like? What is it doing? What is it seeing? And when those things were happening, while we were in bed, just in the next room, there would be grown-ups, might be my uncle and my mother or my grandmother, and they would be mumbling and talking, and you couldn't understand what they were saying because they were so far away and the door was closed, but they were around the corner talking. So I tried to capture that moment in this particular painting.
And then you elaborated on this theme, as I recall, because this is another version. This silhouette in the window um, is, I guess, looking from the outside in, because before you were in the inside looking out, and now you're on the outside looking in. And this piece is called Dreamers.
Well, one of the things you do is I've returned, revisited many themes. The earlier Nightbird was a very personal thing about my own life then. And then I realized, as I did in the Blue series, that there were young Black kids like me all over the country. And they were all dreaming of what they could be. And so this painting was done in 2019 when I had discovered, incidentally, the way the house is built, and I found out that I could use tape, frog tape, to tape it and create these wooden boards. I had not done that before. This is the first painting I used that. But if you notice in this particular painting, I have a semblance of a Confederate flag. I have some targets in there. I have, that was my mom on the porch. She used to sit on the porch at night. But the impediments for these folks, I just wanted to show that, and they are dreamers, and they have to carry that dream through all of these impediments around them. And what the moral of the story is that they have to keep on pushing.
I see this foundation built on these targets, and of course you'll see one of the series that you did, the Targeted Man series, about African American bodies as targets and the X's. So you have these motifs that keep reappearing in your work that are so intriguing, so fascinating that you continue to use those motifs, and that they work so well in batik. Now, this is a Nigerian textile that shows a close-up of the sort of fractal patterns in dye, because dye doesn't just sit on the surface of the material, the dye seeps into the fabric and the paint sits on the surface. So it's fascinating to me that you chose to use dye as your chosen method of how you're communicating, because it's in the fiber, it's right there at the molecular level bonding with the fabric itself. And the fact that you also use cotton, so you have this double, in your work, you have this sort of double reference, because the dye is like indigo, which is such an important part of this history of enslaved Africans who were brought here, because of the early cash crop in South Carolina was grows rice and indigo. And then the fact that it's about a working person, it's about not the refinement of paint, but something quite different. So that decision that you made to use batik, it doesn't seem to be political at first, but it's a very profound semiological or symbiotic connection between the material and your own history as an American of African descent. So I always found this fascinating looking at your work. And in this piece, Veterans with Flag, how is this child a veteran? Why did you name this Veterans with Flag?
I made veterans because they're both veterans. He was a veteran of the war, a war that they did not win. And you see the tattered flag there. But that little boy, whose head kind of looks like a piece of African sculpture, is also a veteran because he had to put up with the oppression. And who knows what it's doing to his life. So both are veterans of strife, only he was the oppressed and the man there was the oppressor.
So you're showing these two sides of the same experience. So this is one of the
Yes,
things that, so this work is really about our American conversation. So,
yes,
and maybe that's part of what your popularity is around, is that people look at these works and they can immediately recognize that you are not really taking a side, but you're standing back and you're looking at the reality of what is happening to all of us in the society, and you are representing or demonstrating that it's not the destruction of time, but the compression, what happens to people over time in these works. Here's another one with three figures above the flag, ghostly figures. The man seems to be wearing a Confederate, the cap of the uniform of the Confederacy.
well, in this particular work, this is one of the early paintings done in the 70s as well. I have three figures, and one of the figures that you notice is an African American. And if you notice that while these other figures are upright and looking at you as an old photograph, notice, and sometimes when you're painting, you don't really know why you do what you do. And as I look at this painting now and looked at it later, is that notice that while the other two figures are looking upright, that figure, which is an African American figure, has his head down, because I'm trying to say something about the status of these folks by the way you situate them in the composition. And of course, below is the flag, the old tattered flag that I've used over and over again. But this painting was a painting that I think expressed more about the era when I started doing this than anything else. You can notice that it's much more sophisticated than some of the other paintings that I've done. And one of the reasons for that is that I had to work and I put wax on this painting and it stayed in the freezer for almost 6 months. And by the time I got it out and dipped it, I had all of these very fine crackle effects in the image, especially the one at the top.
Well, it's very subtle. And like I was saying before, your work, not only is the technique subtle, but the signs and symbols that you use to communicate are very subtle. I mean, the flag is a pretty overt symbol of I guess, Southern life and also of Southern oppression. And then you go through this, and I always say I take responsibility in part for this brightened palette And you do, when you revisit the commemoration series, because it was after I had come to be a curator and had taken some of the administrative aggravation off your shoulders, and your palette brightened up, but this flag is still tattered. It still has this quality of something that's from the past that's haunting us.
But
And yes, go ahead.
what I wanted to do, of course, was, when I started painting the flags, I painted the flags with images, some at the top, some at the bottom, but always images along with the flag. And then I found after doing that that I could express myself fully by painting the flag itself. And I always thought too that I revisited that whole commemoration series. And also, there were a lot of people who were revisiting that era again, like it's coming alive again. So to me, it's also like uh, um, the reinvigoration of the ideas and the ideals of a time gone by that we thought we had gotten over. So
So
this kind of reconstructed flag, resurrected flag.
So that sort of means the issues are not resolved in our society, and we haven't discussed the history that that was the genesis for this flag and for its resurgence. Because in South Carolina, I think we're going to see in a moment of a photograph by Cecil Williams that shows the three flags over the State House, and of course the Confederate flag was not over the State House of South Carolina in 1961. It was put there to commemorate the firing of the shot at Fort Sumter. And then it stayed there until 2000, and then it stayed on the grounds until 2015 because of a tragedy we're going to discuss later in our program. But before we go into that, I was going to ask you about the idea of Roland Barthes, the famous French structuralist, post-structuralist thinker, who talked about the death of the artist. And what he meant was, once you create an image and you put it out before the public, the artist can put all the content into a text that they want, but the public then kind of takes control of your content and interprets it. So as an artist, what do you think of that idea? Is your meaning going to supervene over the meanings of others who see your works, or do they bring their own meaning to what you're doing?
I think of my works as children. I give birth to them, and when they are gone, then they go their own way, and people who see them bring their own interpretation to them. I always think a work of art has the meaning that the artist intends, but it also has the meaning of what the viewer sees. And you can't control what the viewer sees. Right. And sometimes the viewer sees things that you didn't even know were there. The reason works of art still continue to enhance their importance and enhance what you see is because it never exhausts itself. One of the things that I always wanted to do was not create works that people say, oh, I've seen that. And with batik, the batik medium allows me to do this, because traditionally when you look at a work of art, you look at it from a distance because if it's large and you can see the whole thing. With batik, you look at it from a distance, and the closer you get to it, the more you see, because the dye seeps into the fabric and create this multi-layer, multi-dimensional aspect on the surface.
So the longer you look at it, the more you're going to see in it.
Yes.
And that's exactly how your works, that's how they work. That's the thing I was always struck by in the work. This is a Cecil Williams image from 1963 of the three flags: the United States flag, the state of South Carolina flag, and of course, the flag of the battle jack of the Northern Virginia Regiment, and the battle flag of the Confederacy. And that has become so poignant for South Carolinians. But you also, in your work, we see not only just the popular culture, what's happening around us in the political situation, but we see evidence of your engagement with poetry, with literature, with music. Could you talk a little bit about the We Have Known Rivers series? This is one image from the We Have Known Rivers series. And I must tell you, this is one of my favorite paintings, this particular one.
Well, you know, when I was at Claflin, I majored in art, English, and history. And I try to tell my students all the time that art is an intellectual enterprise. It is not just a matter of taking some paint and putting it on canvas, or in my case, taking some dye and dripping it on cloth. Uh, First, this painting shows a reflection. The tree is upside down because it's like you're looking at it in a river. And above it, you see those images of faces, but there could be faces of your ancestors who, in their rituals, painted their faces and made masks. And so, what I have done in this is to show the reflection of a tree as if these people are looking into the water, and those masks are your ancestors looking into the water. And it's a call we have known rivers because it is so subtle in its implication that many of our ancestors came from rivers in Africa, like the Gambia, and they came to South Carolina, and they were again at rivers like the Cooper River and the Ashby River, and creating their food for their slave owners by doing the same things they did in Africa, growing rice and fanning rice and things of that sort. And Hugh's poem is I Have Known Rivers. I changed it to We Have Known Rivers.
Right, the Langston Hughes, the famous Langston Hughes poem that was written on the theme The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which mentions, I think, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and he also mentions the Mississippi. But in South Carolina, of course, we have the Edisto, we have the Santee, we have the Ashley Cooper, and you yourself, you live near these waterways, and the waterways were ways that people communicated because it was easier at first, and they settled the country to go up and down the river as opposed to walk through the dense, the forested, swampy areas of South Carolina. So the river is a communications route as much as it is anything else, but it's also where civilization grows up. What was interesting to me though is that just really struck me as a live oak tree. Um, that's reflected in that water. And the live oak, of course, is like the magnolia, is emblematic of the South. And then that crescent moon also just creates somehow the perfect harmony, the perfect mood, and evokes South Carolina. So, but that's what I'm saying when you have these multiple levels. Well, the masks evoke African ancestors, and as you were saying, the sort of tribal rituals that they might have undergone. And here's another piece that has some clear allusions to music. And again, this was a piece I enjoyed showing. Now, I showed this. We did a show down in Hilton Head, and I remember doing this group, this assemblage group. So would you talk a little bit about Birth of the Blues, Blues for BB, Blues for John Lee, and Blues for Bessie as a conglomerate artwork?
Well, I didn't do many of those things because one of the things that I found out is that sometimes I could not express myself just by painting one work. And the blues has always been interesting to me because there's a old blues singer named Sunhouse, and Sunhouse looks like my dad. And he's from the Delta, and my dad was from the Delta. We didn't know I didn't know he that part of the country because he came from Mississippi to South Carolina. But I remember working at a theater, and each night I had to go home and 11 o'clock because I was projectionist. And it was one of those jobs that many young Black people did not have. And my mom was always scared that some of the kids would do pranks and do things to me. And so she always stayed up. I'd go home and turn the corner. It was a mile. I had to walk a mile home after the movie every night. And I would go and look across the field, and I could see that light. It's like that commercial of Motel 8. She kept the light on for me. But I thought about that, the agony that she must have gone through, waiting for her son to come home. I went through that same thing with my three sons, making when they were out. And now people are going through that same thing with their children. It just seems to me like that was the birth of the blues, feeling upset and blue about what is happening to your children. And so I created this, and the people that you see on the side, John Lee, Bassett, these folks were the prophets who interpreted all of that wailing and all of that loneliness and made songs about it. And those songs are what has kept the blues alive today.
Now, I think this might be one of the first images where you use the reliquary, where you put there's a box here that the viewers may be able to see, and it opened, and inside were batik scarves, I think made of silk. They're beautiful
Yeah,
little
I
objects.
always felt that in those reliquary you could put things that people use, and it's like looking at and in a drawer or looking at a box that somebody has, and what you can tell so much about a person's life by what he or she keeps special to her or him. And so I have used that a couple of times in my work because it's really fascinating to look into somebody's personal items to see what it says about them.
I think our next image has another of the reliquaries embedded, in this case, in the artwork itself, where you've decided to do the batik painting, but on a piece of old lace. And it's Sarah Remembered. Could you just talk a little bit about, because you told me the anecdote about this, so I know what a rich, extraordinary story this is and how it relates to um, every every African American's legacy from the history of enslavement. Would you talk a little bit about who Sarah was and
Sarah was my grandmother's mother. Uh, she was a Missy girl, they say, and that's between 13 and 18 or 19 when freedom came in 1865. And her mother died in childbirth, and her father was sold across the river. This is in St. Stephen Parish. Across the river is in Williamsburg, what is now Williamsburg County, and the Santee River runs between it. And Sarah was raised by other servants because that's what happened when the mother wasn't there. She was raised by other servants, and when the war was over, she became a kind of servant in the household. And I remember my mom saying over and over again, I used to ask her because I wanted to see whether she'd stick to the same story, and she said that after the war, Sarah's father came back across the river to find her, and finally found her. And she said, "Sarah, I'm your daddy or your pappy," she said. And Sarah said, "You ain't my pappy." He said, "The buzzard laid me and the sun hatched me. You ain't my pappy." And I've used that in many of my lectures because I want you to know, and all of our African American students to know, that you are not defined by what people think of you, and you cannot let that hinder you from your dreams.
well,
And so Sarah now for me became somebody special. And if you notice that little reliquary down there, I tried to wonder, here's a little girl with no no mother, raised by servants. What would she keep special to her? An old ball, a piece of gingham cloth? What would she find treasure? What would she do in her spare time to play and bring some happiness to her life? And that's why I included that down there. This is a special painting to me. The Gibbs Museum purchased this painting, and I was happy about that because I believe that Sarah probably came to this nation from through Charleston. And so she was very close to where she came in. And this painting is one of the most popular paintings at the Gibbs. People have seen it and they've written me and asked me about Sarah, tell them more about Sarah. I remember they did an exhibit of women at the Gibbs Museum, and they had these big Gainsborough paintings of the 18th century and all of these beautiful royal women. They were the most popular paintings in the museum. And all of these big paintings from the 18th and early 19th century, and they selected Sarah.
Wow. Because Sarah's story is the story of so many Americans of African descent whose families were dispersed because of institutional slavery. And of course, our country is still recovering from that trauma. And that is part of even the political environment we are in right now. That's a major part of why things are the way they are. So a work like this is timeless in a way because it's your own story, but it's also showing us how we got to where we are. And what I love about it is this little compartment, the little reliquary with these precious things, these little things that each human being would always have some special thing, something precious to him or herself. And to show that, to show the individuality, to show the personal nature of what happens to people who are displaced from their parents, I thought this was just incredibly poignant as it's visual poetry. It's visual poetry. And of course, we come to the crossroads. We're at a crossroads. No, well, we come to this piece, Silent Signals. And I always remark upon, you have both the targets and these symbols at the base. They're like semaphores, and everyone knows that semaphores are the flags that the Navy uses to communicate. And your works, like I was saying before, your works are always functioning on this semiological level. Your works are systems of signs that are telling us something about experience. And even this sort of mystical glow around the X has meaning. Could you talk a little bit about this X? The X marks the spot, the X is a crossroads, the X is a railroad crossing sign. Talk a little bit about this piece for us.
Well, it's always unique to me that the railroad crossing is almost the same structural relationship as a Confederate flag.
Mm.
But that railroad crossing is also significant for African Americans because that's how we left the South, on railroads. And I call this silent signals because I remember growing up late at night, you hear a train whistle and they never stopped in my hometown. It just went, oh. But silent signals is a symbol of how things happen to us and we endure them silently. Segregation, name calling, times when they would say things to us and we could not say anything back, where we would have to, as my mom said, bite our tongues. And so there were always silent signals that provided that. For instance, the X there might be the elimination of something. It might be a railroad crossing, but it also might be the flag without the stars and without the color. And so I like to create meanings, multiple meanings, so that people can see, bring themselves into it and feel something by what they see. And I wanted this particular work to be haunting because we all have these ideas and feelings that what happened to us a long time ago. We could all tell these stories about that. And we've gone about it silently and we think about it in a way that as if it happened yesterday, but we have not told anybody about it. And so I tried to create that kind of mystery, the fogginess of a light coming at you at night, and all of that kind of mystery in this particular work.
Well, you told me the anecdote about the sort of, it's almost like this crossing sign is seen in the light that you might see from the headlight of a train coming down the tracks in the fog at night, and the loneliness that symbolizes was part of what I find so haunting about this particular image. because it suggests both travel, but also the displacement and a kind of isolation. Because when African Americans went on the Great Migration, they got on the trains, they went to Philadelphia and Chicago and Washington, New York, but they had to leave their families behind. They were going into the unknown, and this really does, I think, bring that home. This image really does bring that home. To me, it does. Now, this is another of the flag series. Now, this was when the flag was still over the State House in South Carolina.
Yeah.
And you talked about this because this flag really does look like it's been embattled. It almost looks scarred.
Well, this is one of the largest flags I've done, and you can't see it. You have to get up close to. But this is one of the first flags where I use pattern material. So that's a kind of gingham material that the flag is painted on top of that. So when you look at it, you see the flag, but you also see the kind of material that they could have worn during this particular time. And the flag itself is just a partial. You see part of it is missing. And I tried to suggest that it's fading away, it's going away, it's a deteriorating relic of the past. And this flag is in the collection of our state museum, which is to me is a great place for it to be. And it's been used many times it's on the cover of a book by an author, and it's been published a lot because I suspect that you see enough of the flag, but you also see enough of deterioration as well.
Well, this flag is going to lead us into the next part, this discussion of this painful episode in South Carolina from 2015 that you did such a poignant series for. And of course, this is your photograph of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Mother Emmanuel, it's referred to. One of the oldest historic congregations in our state of the AME, from the AME faith. And this beautiful sort of Gothic revival building with this three-part entry with the pointed standard Gothic arches, and this very sharply angled, the pitch of this roof is something that becomes important in your treatment in response to what happened here. So I'm going to go to your first image because our next image is the first you did in that series from Mother Emmanuel. Would you talk just a little bit about what precipitated your creating that series?
Well, I was at home at night when I listened looking at television, and then all of a sudden they said it was a shooting in Charleston, and the news kept them because they didn't know what it was. They were all down there, and we found out that these people were killed in the church, and there were people standing out there mourning. And Mother Emanuel was kind of special to me. Arthur Rose, my art teacher, was a member of that church, and I had been to that church many times. And people at South Carolina State had gone to that church while I was there. And it was just so horrifying that I knew I had to do something. You know, as an artist, you're not insensitive to the world around you. And I did something about the hurricane early in my life. We spoke about Sarah. And like that, this impacted my life, and I felt that I had to say something. And so I did this painting, and if you notice, there's a small reliquary there. And it was purchased by an architect in Nashville, Tennessee, almost as soon as it was done. I did another one, and that was purchased, that was gone. And then I was doing a small thing, and they wanted a friend of mine wanted me to donate something for Spoleto because they were raising money for the Spoleto Festival. Mm-hmm. And I don't like to do that because what happens is the work doesn't sell for the same thing in the gallery, and the gallery is concerned about that. But I gave it to her to donate it to her because she was a very good friend, and she took it down to Charleston, and the work was 14 by 19, and it sold for $14,000. Mm. And I was just taken back. I didn't get in that money. The museum got the Spoleto got the money, but I was taken aback about how many people found something of value in that small piece. And so she came back and she said, you know, this was the most popular thing in that exhibition because they had works by a lot of artists who donated things. And she said, why don't you do 9?
Hmm.
And I thought, 9? It takes me about 3 or 4 weeks to do a painting. 9 paintings, but I said, you know, I'll try that. I'll try that. So I did the 4th one, I did the 5th one, and then I got into a zone where my feelings just overtook me, and I started painting more and more. And the connection was, of course, the spire. If you notice that I did not try to recreate a painting of Mother Emanuel.
No.
I don't think you have to do that. As an artist, you can suggest things. And so with the cross on top of that spire suggested that. And I used the number 9. And that was in every one of the paintings, there was 9 there. And when I look back on this, it was just a spike of inspiration to simply do these paintings. And after I did them, as soon as I got them, people who, the woman who even suggested that I do 9 came back and her husband bought one of the paintings. So the paintings were bought before they were even done. And then I knew I had to do 9 and I was getting near the end. And I thought, what should I do with this last painting? You know, when you hear Handel's Messiah, you stand up because this was the highlight of that thing. And I could not do a hallelujah moment in this, but I knew I had to do something that was significant to bring all of this together. And then I thought that what happened at Mother Emanuel, as tragic as it was just an isolated incident that has happened to African American over the years. You can look back at all Emmett Till, all of these people who died, the tragedies of massacres that they've died. And then I remembered a poem by James Weldon Johnson, which I think summed it all up. And I don't usually use words in my painting, but I had to use words here. And it says, we have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. And that is the story of Mother Emanuel. That's how Mother Emanuel recreates our journey. And it's just a something that happened on that journey. And of course, since Mother Emanuel, you've seen what has happened.
Well, it's incredibly poignant that you use James Weldon Johnson's Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, as, again, this is music, this is other arts informing your art. And of course, there were the 9 victims, although I know that the paintings were not dedicated toward any particular victims, but I think you knew Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who was also in the South Carolina legislature. And I was just going to say the names of the 9 victims, because we always hear the name of the perpetrator. We don't hear the names of the victims. And I was just going to say that it was Cynthia Marie Graham, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lee Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tawanza Sanders, Sharonda Coleman Singleton. And Tawanza, I think, was the youngest of all the victims. And I knew Sharonda Coleman Singleton. Myra Thompson, I think, was also a Bible study teacher who was murdered executed in this awful interaction between a young man who was so consumed by hate and irrationality that I don't know if he was a victim of society or a victim of a lack of education, but the fact that he could have done something so cruel was what was so horrifying. And it took that to remove this flag from the State House. And when you have the flag here, the flag in the series goes through permutations, And this was, I think, the most striking flag because it looks like an enormous blood stain. And you did that consciously.
Yeah, I do. And if you notice that the facade of Mother Emanuel is white,
Right.
and I believe what happened in Mother Emanuel is a stain on that whiteness, that purity of the religion. And so I tried to suggest that in each one of the works.
Well, of course, he was greeted with love. They shared a meal with him and they prayed with him, and then he shot them dead. The other thing that was striking to me was your use of symbols of South Carolina, the crescent moon, the palmetto tree. And I think I told you before that there was a sixth grade class that came from James Island to the museum when these were on display in the Stanback. And this young group of sixth graders were so well informed. They were almost shocking to me in how well they interpreted the works, how thoughtful and poetic their reasoning was. And one young man even knew the history of the palmetto tree and the palmetto logs used during the Revolution for the battlements of the forts, that the palmetto logs, because they're so spongy, the cannonballs would bounce off of them. He knew all of these details about the history of South Carolina, a young African American student from James Island. And your work helped bring out all of this knowledge that these young people, when they saw this, so it was not just seen as a tragedy, this was seen as a moment of reflection, understanding, awareness, and enlightenment as well. And I think that's been a great deal of what the appeal has been about this series.
Hmm. Well, it's really interesting that has occurred.
Now, this was a targeted man series we had talked about before. And would you just, and this one's called Fallen, the title is Fallen, but there were four in the museum that I just returned to you because
Yeah.
you're about to have an exhibition. But would you talk a little bit about why you chose to do the theme of the targeted man?
Well, I think African Americans are targeted. You don't have to believe me. All you got to do is get in your car and drive, and have the police stop you. Cars will go by all the time, but if he sees you, especially if you're driving a nice one, he's going to stop you. And the reason they're doing it is because you're targeted, and you could be targeted not just driving your car. You could be targeted when you go to school. A professor in a class can target you and say, I remember at the University of Georgia, I would be in a class and the only African American, and nobody would ask me, he wouldn't even ask a question. He wouldn't, I hold my hand up in this big class, we in doctoral program, and he never, one day he said, he pointed to me, he didn't call my name, he pointed to me, and I said, well, I think, and everybody in the place turned around and looked at me. And that's when I learned that when you're gonna have the center of attraction, you gotta have yourself together and say something very profound. And that always happens to me when I'm on boards. You know, if you're gonna say something, make sure that it's very significant. And so targeted man is about the fact that we are targeted. Sometimes you can be a whole group of folk, one person is targeted. And we can't get it off our backs because of our color. We can't hide amid other people because they know that one, that's the one. And that is something that we have to live with, and we have to learn how to negotiate the targets that are put on us.
Well, that's what you just pointed out. It's part of the foundation of enslavement, because the reason that Africans were cited as the people who would be easy to enslave is because they were easy to identify. They couldn't run away and hide in the general populace. So that what you're pointing out as a targeting, that was actually a part of what was our history in this nation. So now this is the last flag. You said you've done more than one on this theme of the last flag. And
well, I think I'm hoping
hmm.
when I'm doing my last flags. I did a whole series of exhibits of flags that were 36 by 40 at a big show at the Greenville Museum that I call Last Flag. I call them last flags because almost all of them are disintegrating. And in this particular one, I mentioned to you earlier about composition. And this is an example of composition, of putting the figure down at the bottom and the flag at the top and all that space in between. In fact, that flag is flying there, but you don't even know what it's flying on. You just see that the flag is flying, but it's being held up there by something. One of the things that I always try to do is not insult the intelligence of the viewer. That I was so fascinated by the works of Rembrandt, where you put a head in a canvas and then he put the hands down there and the hands are holding something, and there's nothing really in between but this darkness, but you know there can't be hands and no head, that there can't be heads and no hands. And so as a viewer, you simply fill it in.
Right.
And I like to do that. One of my professors called it sight guys. This is what you know, and your brain fills it in. So I like my viewers, the viewer, people who view my work, to get their brain involved. Like we were talking this whole session about little things I put in. I don't know that I put them in. To me, they're refreshing for me to put in. And when I'm working, I'll say, maybe I'll put this here, maybe I'll put that here. Sometimes I put it out of place so that the viewer can actively get involved in seeing.
Well, active seeing, or so that's something that I have a personal passion about, because many people think that art is passive. They think that it's a static object, and so I don't have to do anything. I just look at it and go, oh yeah, that's pretty, and they move on. But with artworks, it's not like a computer screen. It's not like so much of what we have in technology. The viewer must proactively engage, and since you were a specialist in aesthetics, um, that is interesting to me, that you do require this proactive engagement by the viewer to do what I call active looking, to search their own experience as they're looking at what you've presented. And that's to me.
Let me just go back to the Mother Emanuel series for a minute. I've always felt that you can engage the viewer, but it's not like going to the theater. You're a captive audience. You paid your money, so you're going to look at the movie. When you go to a concert, you're going to listen to it because it's engaging your ears. But works of art are on the walls, and they have to say something to you to say, "Come over here and look at me." And what struck me more than anything about the Mother Emanuel series is that what I said, that one of the things that I required, I told my gallery director when she was booking the show, that make sure that the show is in a room space all by itself, and that the pieces were spaced far enough apart so that people can contemplate on them by having benches there, and also to make sure that a video, which was actually made by a group of men who saw the paintings and themselves decided to do this video. And what has struck me more than anything about that series is that I have never had it shown where somebody didn't come out of the gallery crying. People would come up to me and try to express their feelings, and tears would be running down their eyes. And it was, to me, shocking, because I had never seen anybody react to works of art like that. Well, somebody once said a long time ago when I had a series on the hurricane, I had them around in my office, and she wasn't my student, but she was at USC, and she'd come by and look at what I'm doing because she was in media. And she looked at those works and she said, "These works are so spiritual." That's the first time I had ever heard that word, spiritual. And I figured you can't say, well, I think I'll go to the studio and do something spiritual today. No. It must come from something inside. And so when she said it, it struck me as really very internal to a person. And then over the years, every now and then, I've heard that over and over again. Mother Emanuel series, some other works that I've done, I've heard the word spiritual. And to me, that word perhaps mean more than anything else. Even a review, I got a good review in Art in America, the big magazine, but the word spirituals even tops that.
Well, because I think, I'm not surprised that people would go to see your works, especially something as poignant as the Mother Emanuel series or the Hurricane Hugo series that you referred to, um, also, because they show us something about a shared human experience. And when you cut to that kind of essential communication, where you are not only recognizing the intelligence of the viewer, but in a work like this, one of your more recent works, this image on the death of George Floyd, where you are leaving a great deal to the viewer in terms of inference from what you're implying. So in this piece, you have this arrangement in the foreground, these figures, and then this ghost of a flag on them symbolizing something that's motivating these people who did not show the human, the simple human act of empathy or mercy. So would you just talk a little bit about this? And this is the second to the last of the images we're going to show. But I found this also to be very moving and very disturbing. You can see down here the image. This is George Floyd beneath the pressure of Chauvin, who was the officer who knelt on his neck for what was it, 8 minutes
Well,
and 46 seconds?
I had never seen what happened um, with George Floyd before. I'd never thought about it in that way before, but we watched a man die in front of our eyes. And we watched a man who killed him show no remorse. It was like man's inhumanity to man on steroids. I had never seen anybody. How could you be so cruel? And the sensitivity of his knee on his neck, he must have felt through his nerve endings, life seeping out of this man. And yet his face as if he was going for a walk in the park. And I thought that in George Floyd, we saw all of the pain and suffering that we have suffered as African Americans coming here as slaves personified in that moment. And so I just started doing some drawings. And the thing that I always remember is, even Picasso said it, that you can't let your emotions get in the way of your aesthetics, because you are creating a work of art and you're feeling deeply about it. But the same thing with Mother Emanuel, I had that experience. I didn't want to. This is a very large paintings. It is 3 feet wide by 4 feet high. And it was difficult to do because I don't work that large except if I'm doing a flag, and that's one image. There are multiple images here. This painting took about 6 weeks to do, and it was finished on a Monday, and it was sold on a Wednesday to the Alexandria, Virginia, to the seminary, the Virginia Theological Seminary, and it's going to be used as a part of their 200th anniversary celebration in 2022. It was just gone just like that. Usually I have my work around and I could look at it and think about it and muse over it. This one was gone before I could even do that. But it is a work that it's going to a place where they prepare priests for the Anglican Church. And so I think that it's going to be in good hands. The nicest thing comment I had about this painting is that the people at the seminary last week came by here because they want to commission me to do another work, and said that the National Gallery of Art has a framer that frame all of their works, and that they took this work to have it framed to that framer in Washington. And the framer, when he started doing the work and looked at it, he said, this will be the most significant work I've framed since I did the portraits of Michelle and Barack Obama.
Wow.
And that was that was a nice statement, like the Woodrow statements, like some other statements that I've heard that I treasure, like Woodrow saying, "Where did you come from, Twigs? How did you, I like your stuff."
Well, that just reminds me also that you were invited, especially invited to offer a Christmas ornament to the White House. What year was that? That
Well,
was
I think 1988, I think,
no,
no,
it's two,
2008, something like
it's
that.
2000. It was 2000. I think it was probably
Yeah,
around
I
2006
did
or
one.
so.
I did one for the Bushes were there at the time.
Right.
George W. Bush, Mrs. Bush decided to do an ornaments, and she wanted every state to have an ornament. And I was asked to do the ornament from South Carolina, and I did the mayor's house.
Right.
Because I knew there were other people in the state who were asked to, and nobody would have done the mayor's house because it was out in the field and they had hay in it. And so I did the mayor's house. And after I did the mayor's house, it drew some attention because it was out there and anybody could have ridden by the street and burned it. And Senator Nichols from Greenwood raised some money along with Mr. Clyburn, and they took that house and put that house in Greenwood now, and it's a part of a display, an African American display there. And I feel so good about that effort.
So just to contextualize it for our students, it's the Benjamin Mays house. Benjamin Mays, who actually was a graduate of the high school at South Carolina State University, and he taught there for a year, went on to teach at Howard University, and later went on to be the president of Morehouse University. And Benjamin Mays, who was a internationally renowned specialist in education, was the mentor of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but he was born in Epworth, South Carolina. And so
Yes.
he used his house to represent the state, showing this this global reach of a South Carolinian, and extending through his student to this incredible international recognition. So again, this very nuanced, very subtle, very interesting way of approaching a topic. And this is my last this is the last work, and I have to end with this question. So when you are approaching creating the creative process, are you approaching the works as an empiricist or a rationalist? And of course, by that I mean, are the works emerging themselves, creating their kind of own story from your experience of creating the work, or do you go into the work with a preconception about what you're going to make and how it's going to look? So are these works, do they have a life of their own? Are they emerging from the process, or are they something that you've conceptualized in advance?
Well, jazz for me, is I love jazz. I got it in my studio. I'd be playing it right now if I were not talking, because I like the improvisational aspect of jazz. And that is why I like batik, because when you put the die on, the die will run some places and it will create images and things that you didn't even know. And you simply take that and build on it. And so it's the improvisational method that I improvise, that I use in my work, in my improvisations. And so with this particular work, we're talking about a conversation. In fact, that's what we've having this whole program. We've been having a conversation about my art. But what I wanted to talk about here is that in this country, we need to have a conversation about racism.
Right.
And we've never had that, because we skirt that. We don't want to deal with those hard questions. And this was a work that was done for the Mint Museum. And the Mint Museum had the Mother Emanuel series, and they asked people to make comments. And when I was deciding what to paint for them, I asked him to the Curie of Contemporary Art to bring some of those comments. And I took the comments, read them over, and then when I started working, I thought about the two things, and that's in my work sometimes. What are the two themes that I want to express? And then as I work, I improvise and I take out and I put in, and here it's a conversation between a white person and a black person, and the black person is targeted, as you've seen in many of my works, and the white person has this baggage of his Southern heritage that includes the Confederate flag, and they have to talk to each other, and there's this barrier in between that they have to get over. And then if you notice in the bottom of it that you can't see, I have symbols of 9 and all those atrocities that's happened to us, and a sentence that dedicated to the proposition that, and I just left it that way. And that's all written in that space down there, along with an arrow that suggests segregation. So what I tried to do is put things in there that when people looking at it, they could manufacture their conversations. What would you say if you had to say something about your predicament and about the relationship you have to your white brothers and sisters or your Black brothers and sisters? And so that's how this came about.
Dr. Leo Twiggs, there's nothing else I can say. Thank you for this extraordinary conversation, and thank you for your artworks. And you are, in your artworks, providing a kind of demonstration for a dialogic or a dialectical interaction between not only the audience, the audience and the artist, but between the different members of our society and their political and ideological viewpoints that they have to come to terms with and realize, well, we're on one small planet and we've got to share the resources. And your work is bringing that so poignantly and beautifully before the public. So thank you for the time. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for all your work. And thank you for this art.
And thank you for your invitation. I hope it's something of value.
Thank you. And that concludes our program. This has been Dr. Leo F. Twiggs, who has been talking about the politics and perception of history and heritage within his work. And I'd like to thank, you mentioned jazz, I'd like to thank the Skip Pearson Jazz Foundation for their support and assistance in creating this program. And of course, here's the logo that you designed for the museum. And that'll be our last, our last image, more of your work. Thank you, Dr. Twiggs.
Thank you.
All right, so long.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Let me tell you, one of the things I learned a lot about what
Can you hear
Mike
me?
says. I'm